Chapter 5 An Indian Feast in the Rubber Forest. Farewell to Civilization. Dr. Yabiru is holding a big feast over there today. He has had a lot of chicha brewed. You'll come along, won't you? Regino looked at me expectantly. You mustn't miss this. Who is Yabiru? One of the last of the Arua. The tribe has almost died out. The Tupari overpowered some of them and gradually ate them up. Only one remained alive, the thin man with the bad arm. Another part of the tribe escaped to here. But in a few years there probably won't be a single one left. They can't stand up to colds in the head. Poor devils. What does this Yabiru do? Does he live far from here? Half an hour's walk on the other side of the Rio Branco. We had better go by Costco. The path is still flooded in places. It will certainly be worth it. All the caboclos in the district are going, even those working in the fields here. But surely they all come from different tribes. Do they manage to hit it off at a feast like this? That's another question, to be sure, admitted Regino. They talk together almost entirely in Makarap. They all of them understand it. Many Makarap men have Yabuti wives and vice versa, and the Arua in their turn are married to Makarap wives. That all makes for understanding. But one man will say of another that he is a poisoner and is in communication with evil spirits. There are actually a few notorious poisoners here, especially among the Yabuti, and yet they hold this communal feast. Well, you don't know the caboclos. If there's any shisha anywhere about, all fear and enmity is forgotten. Besides, it would be a provocation not to accept an invitation to the feast. And after all, it's not every time that someone gets poisoned. Evening came, and we went to visit Yabiru. Beside his spacious hut stood several other smaller buildings. Round about stretched a well-tended clearing, and paths along which Yabiru and 2 or 3 other Indians brought in the rubber ran into the forest in all directions. We were not the first guests. Outside the house sat about 24 Indians on tree trunks, which had been dragged up to provide seats. They all wore clean cotton shirts and trousers, and on their heads gaily colored feather head-dresses, or circular hats of palm straw. The women squatted beside their husbands on the ground, or stood about in groups, chatting. Almost every one carried a baby in her arms, or in a sling which hung from her right shoulder down to her left hip. In this way the infant sat astride its mother's hip bone, and was easily supported by her without tiring. When Alfredo, the chief's son and foreman, appeared, I had a surprise. Usually he insisted on being a civilicado, and would have nothing to do with the old Indian ways. But now he stood there wearing a headdress which put all the rest to shame. A really magnificent affair of soft pink stork feathers and gaudy parrot and toucan feathers. His wife, too, had become an Indian woman again today. She had painted her arms and legs with black streaks and wavy lines, and decorated her face with red. No less fantastic did her small baby look. From his head down to his little legs, he was painted black. Indeed, his young mother had even supplied, in place of the hair he had not yet grown on his head, some black resin which covered his small skull like a bathing cap. The Tupari were standing to one side, as if they were ashamed of their beggarly nakedness. The younger lads had woven themselves circular head dresses of yellowish palm straw. They stood there silent, leaning on their bows and bundles of arrows. Some held instead a staff in their hands. The journalist had taken their weapons away with him, and a decent bow cannot be made overnight. "Doto Toma Chica," said Yabiru, in greeting to us, and proffered me an enamel mug. "It is maize chicha. It won't make you drunk." I tried it. It was maize chicha, fermented, it is true, but comparatively harmless. I had long since become accustomed to this thick, flat drink from my stay in tropical Bolivia. "Está bom?" asked the friendly Indian, when I handed him back the empty mug. "It is good, thank you," I said. Satisfied, he went back into the hut. The guest had drunk and shown that he knew how to appreciate his chicha, as far, that is, as a white man is capable of doing so. The sun disappeared behind the trees. The Indians ran back and forth with filled gourds, and the conversations on the small open space grew louder. But the time for getting properly drunk had not yet come. The hosts now dragged a quantity of roast wild boar, deer, monkeys, woodcock, and other animals out of the house, and sat everything on the ground in front of the guests, who were sitting around. No second bidding was needed. From all sides rang out the crack of the blows of bush knives with which the men cut up the animals. Nor was there any lack of vegetables. Yucca and yams baked in ashes, maize, and yucca mash and the like, stewed in large leaves. "Doctor, do you like nambu?" Yabiru's eyes glittered drunkenly. "Está bom," said Regino encouragingly, and we ate together a nambu, a forest fowl whose flesh is unusually tender and succulent. When the banquet came to an end, darkness had already fallen. The hosts cleared off the remains of the feast. A gentle cracking and chewing betrayed the fact that the dogs were at work on the bones. From the darkness of the wood a vigorous tooting rang out. "They are tuning the instruments," said Regino, turning to me. "Instruments. Yes, bamboo pipes. They whittle away at them until they get the right note." It was some little time before the musicians were satisfied with their instruments. In the middle of the small open space a long pole was stuck into the ground, and the tender, whitish inner leaves of a palm were tied to it. The guests had renewed their attention to the chicha. The Indians hurried without a pause to refill the empty gourds in the big, dimly lit hut. "Listen," said Regino. "Things are really starting now. There's one of them vomiting. That's a part of every feast here. Drink, vomit, and so on, until morning, when there is no chicha left. Then they often vomit into the bowl and drink the same chicha 2 or 3 times. To the drunken man who had just voided himself, a figure went up and handed a large calabash. He took it in both hands and emptied it in a draught. The two of them laughed, put their arms round each other's neck, and vanished into the house. In the meantime the moon had risen. The musicians had assembled in a circle. Behind them the other Indians took up their positions. Each one carried a weapon, hunting gun, bow and arrows, or a long two-edged espada of black palm wood. Their free hand they placed on the shoulder of the man next to them, or in front of them. Now the music started in short bursts. The musicians and dancers began to pace forwards and backwards in time with the melody, 3 paces in towards the pole with the palm leaves and 3 paces back again. At every third step forward the dancers stamped hard on the ground with their right feet. Again and again they repeated the same steps, and the wind instruments sounded uninterruptedly. Slowly the dance circled round. At one moment the ring was closed, the next it seemed to break up in a fascinating rhythm. At last the players grew tired and finished with a strange cadence. Hoo! They all roared and stopped dead. Fresh chicha was brought up. Musicians and dancers drank, and now and again bent over to one side. The dance began afresh. Hitherto the women had only sat and stared. Now they rose, suspended their babies on their sides, and joined the dance. The Tupari still remained aloof and watched the spectacle from a distance. Now and then a makarap, or an arua, came and offered them a bowl of chicha to drink. However, in the long run the lads could not resist the temptation. They joined the dancers, and their naked bodies, pacing back and forth in quick rhythm, made the whole appearance of the revels, which grew louder every minute, seem even more wild and primitive. But the old men did not move. Only when I addressed them did they try to smile. What could be putting them into so thoughtful a mood? I grew tired and lay down in a hammock in one of the small outbuildings. When I woke, the moon had gone down. In the clearing, pieces of the raw rubber with which the caboclos and the civilicados lit their huts when there was no paraffin to be had, were burning and smoking. The dancing, singing, and playing, drinking and vomiting, laughing and shouting were still in full swing. Only when daylight had come and the sun was shining on the tops of the tall trees did the circle of dancers grow smaller. The musicians threw the bamboo trumpets into the middle of the square, emptied the last bowls of crude beer, and prepared to set out for home with their wives and children. Meanwhile, in the dwelling house, the ducks had awakened. They quacked contentedly about, drinking greedily from the huge puddles of regurgitated chicha, through which the last guests were wading almost up to the ankles. Weary with lack of sleep and heavy-lidded, we returned to the baracao of Salouy. On a sharp bend of the river, the rowers almost capsized the canoe, which was heavily overloaded with women and children. For a moment they started up from their half-sleep, but the danger once over, they broke out into drunken laughter, and then rowed on in their bemused rhythm. These 3 weeks which I spent in Saint-Louis thus gave me a small foretaste of what I could expect with the Tupari, and at the same time a picture of how, in such an encampment, things Indian were mingled with the farthest radiations of Western civilization. There were on the one hand the Tupari Indians, who had come here in an 8 days' journey through the jungle. About 20 years before they had seen their first white man. At that time they still worked with stone axes, and had no knowledge of iron or glass, and did not understand what the white men wanted of them. Even now they were leading their own lives, as before, free and untrammeled. The rest of the Indian workers, the Makarap, Yabuti, Arua, and whatever else they called themselves, had, on the other hand, already become, for the most part, serfs of the civilized people. From the Amazon, from Para, from Serra, from Rio de Janeiro, from Bolivia and Peru, men had come here to make their fortune. They were strangers in this ancient Indian territory, but they had complete control of the situation. The caboclos, the children of the forest, were the vanquished in a struggle which looked peaceful enough, but which was merciless. But let me go back to the Tupari. Slowly but surely they went about their work, dragged up heavy beams and posts under the direction of Senor Regino, erected the framework of the farinha plant, and fetched from the forest huge piles of palm leaves to cover the new building. With old hoes and bush knives they removed the weeds from a mandioca field, which was overgrown and had run wild, complained all day long of hunger and of the mosquitoes which would not let them sleep at night, and never tired of assuring me how fine it was by contrast where they lived. Fresh chicha every day, ground nuts, many kinds of succulent tubers, and countless monkeys and other animals to hunt. In a word, life with the white men seemed to them a hell, which they endured only in order to receive an axe or a bush knife. But back at home in their Maloka, it was a heaven upon earth. The morning of the 13th June had scarcely dawned when the Tupari assembled in the administrative building. They had finished their work and were ready to set off. Each one carried his rolled-up hammock hung round his head. In their hands they held a basket of plaited palm leaves in which they expected wages could be stowed. Some had wrapped a small snack for the journey in large leaves, or carried a few corn cobs tied to strips of bast. Ongle had awaited this day with anxiety. The Indians had finished their prescribed work, slowly, it is true, but to his satisfaction, and now on the empty shelves of the shop there was nothing with which he could pay an even approximately fair wage for the weeks of work, however low one fixed the daily rate. The boss had not yet arrived, and it depressed this honest Swabian to send the poor fellows away empty-handed. But there was nothing else to be done. He shared out the few miserable remains which he could scrape together in the store, a little tobacco, some cigarette papers, a few boxes of matches, and a few pounds of salt for each. Only 3 or 4 Indians, including the chief, Kurame, and his impotent son, Kurame, received an axe, the most precious thing these savages could be given. With sad faces the Tupari took their scanty wages, and I was working out in my mind the best way of distributing my baggage among the 20 men. But when I looked round for them, they had vanished into thin air. Only 3 or 4 still stood there with mournful expressions. "Embora Moloka, gone Moloka," they said, and pointed into the forest. Their companions had to a man left me in the lurch and made off. Now I was really in a hole. What was I to do without porters and guides? Ongle could not spare any caboclos or any other hands. They were all busy with preparations for harvesting the rubber. Heavens above, how wretched and deserted I felt on that Sunday morning. The little cook put in her word. You shouldn't have shared out anything before everyone had his load on his back. But Ongle cut her short. Outside the barracao, the 4 mules were stamping impatiently. They were to take provisions on that day to some rubber allotments which lay along the route. The Tupari will sleep the first night at Andres, eh? He asked. Alfredo, who was standing helplessly by. Senor, good, then we'll load the doctor's baggage onto the mules. You'll catch up with the Tupari at Andres, if not before. Greatly relieved, I grasped the helpful manager by the hand. Good luck and goodbye for the present, he said, and then I began my trek into the jungle. Kurumi loaded up his bundle and trotted along behind me. Are you really coming all alone to our Maloka? He asked me incredulously. Yes, all alone. Why do you ask? The fellow wrinkled his brow, but said no more. Chapter 6. Entertained by a mass murderer. It was only half an hour before we overtook the Tupari. They were squatting in a small clearing by the road and looked towards me in friendly fashion. Obviously, they had banked on the mules carrying my baggage part of the way, provided that they just made off at the right time. We continued our march together. 2 rubber gatherers, young Brazilians with sick, worn faces, joined us. They worked in a colocacao which we would reach the next day. So, you are going to the Tupari, doctor? They asked me. Aren't you at all frightened? Why should I be? The Tupari are good fellows. They did no harm to any of their previous visitors, but they were never on their own. You never know where you are with Indians, they said. If you go in 2s or 3s, they have more respect for you. But to go alone like this, it's just too easy for them to make away with you. We followed the narrow path and were silent for a while. What do you really want to do among the Indians? Said one of the rubber gatherers, reviving the conversation. Study their way of living, I answered. Study the way the Indians live. What do you get paid for it? He inquired. Paid nothing at all, I replied, but at once noticed that by this answer I had lowered myself very much in the estimation of these people. A man who exposes himself to such hardships and dangers without making himself a fortune must obviously be a prize idiot. So I hastened to add, perhaps I shall write a book afterwards or something for a newspaper. This did make sense to them. There are many women among the Tupari, began the second. Of my companions, you mark my words, when you reach the Maloka, the chief will at once give you a wife, or even two." Unconcealed envy sounded in his voice. "But you must be very careful. The Indians set a whole lot of man-traps and pits round their Maloka. Anyone who doesn't know his way about and runs into one stays there." Then he related a lot more about treacherous attacks, poisoned arrows, food and drink, and the spells of the medicine men, the doctors. "Have you ever been in a Maloka?" I asked him. "No, I haven't myself, but one of my best friends told me, and so we wandered through the wooded plains, or panted up a steep hill. We shall all sleep together at Andre's tonight, shan't we?" I asked, turning to them both again. "Yes," at Andre's they confirmed. "The mules will also spend the night there." Andre, how often I had heard his name in Saint-Louis. They were grim stories which were told about him. He was the son of a Makarop and a Yabuti. These two neighboring tribes must have intermarried long before the arrival of the whites. Today their intermingling was far advanced, but the half-breeds were very intent on being considered Makarop. True, the Yabuti were proud fellows, and I was to later learn, but on the Rio Branco they were looked upon as a kind of second-rate Indian. Why, I do not know. Nor did I gather whether Andre spent his childhood in a free Maloka or grew up with the rubber gatherers. At all events, he came at an early age to Saint-Louis and there worked with the white people. At that time, Senor R., a former official of the Indian Protection Service, bought up the vast forest of the Rio Branco together with the Baracao of Saint-Louis and everything that went with it. He lived with his family in Guajara and had no great inclination to run his out-of-the-way property himself, although, or even perhaps because, he had spent half his life as a colleague of the famous General Rondon on daring expeditions in the Mato Grosso. He contented himself with going once a year to Saint-Louis by motorboat, fetching away bales of rubber, latex, Brazil nuts, ipacacuana roots, rice, ground nuts, and farina in large boats, and distributing a few boxes and bales of materials, tools, and all kinds of trinkets as a reward to the caboclos. The first manager installed by Senor R. in Saint-Louis was a Bolivian. He was experienced in that line and also thought he knew how to deal with Indians. His regime in Saint-Louis defies all description. I know how little one can rely on the tales only too readily related in these lonely districts by people who are bored and prone to exaggeration, but unimpeachable witnesses have told me things about this slave driver of which they were themselves ashamed. Early in the morning, this manager paraded the Indians and allotted them their tasks. In the evening, anyone who had not fulfilled his quota, or had in some other way not conducted himself satisfactorily, was bound, locked up, and flogged without mercy. The Bolivian made free with their wives and daughters worse than any sultan with his subjects. He had, it is true, a wife and child of his own, but nevertheless he took Indian women who found favor with him, had his pleasure of them, and then passed them on as he thought fit to his white and black staff. And the proud Indians, they put up with it all. The white man had already shown that he was stronger. Did he not bring the iron tools, the fine materials for trousers, shirts, and coats, the combs and mirrors, scented hair oil, and fine soap? Was he not in possession of firearms, against which bow and arrows appeared mere toys? Did he not control all the rivers, far and near, with his motorboats and steamships? And how boldly he came on the scene, even when he faced Indians in much greater numbers. Did not even the seediest of these white and black strangers talk with the pride and assurance of a chief? Only too well did the whites manage to strengthen and exploit this feeling of inferiority on the part of the Indians. Up to quite recently it had been a custom of these despots of the Amazon to keep a private bodyguard, called Capangas. Actually, without this private police, no store, no safe, and no woman would have been secure in the rubber gatherers' encampments, for the place swarmed with adventurers and criminals on the run, and the state police were hundreds of miles away. And so every rubber king picked out from his employees the boldest fellows and the best shots, and gave them in return for good pay a new and congenial job to protect him and his barcao against thieves and bandits. And on occasion these bravos were called upon for special, secret, mopping up activities. Time and time again there would be objectionable neighbors and competitors of whom one wanted to be rid, or perhaps a capable rubber gatherer might come into the office and after years of hard work would want his credit balance paid out. He too had to vanish from the face of the earth. Then again, refractory Indians would revolt and refuse to work under conditions of slavery. From time to time, an example had to be made of them. It mattered little if here or there one of them died under a flogging, provided that their fellow rebels saw reason once more. The Capangas coped with all this gladly and willingly. This was an open secret on the Amazon, and an abomination to every decent South American. But before the eyes of the manager at St. Louis, the petty despots hovered as a shining example. He too built up a little group of Capangas with which he terrorized the inhabitants of the woods round the Rio Branco. He intended to train his Indians. They were to work as obediently as donkeys, and eat out of his hands like tame dogs. If one of the unhappy victims escaped back to the Molucca, the Capangas followed on his track, and where could one not find traitors who would hand over one of their own tribe out of fear or in hopes of a good reward? Such was the new regime on the Rio Branco, where hitherto white men and Indians had worked peacefully together. But the pitcher can go to the well once too often. One day young Andre was to be tied up and punished. I do not know what offense he was accused of, but Alfredo, the foreman at St. Louis, told me the following story. I was in my colocao with my wife Magdalena, about an hour's journey downstream from St. Louis. One evening a kapanga arrived and summoned me to the manager. I had some misgivings. According to the kapanga's story, Andre had had a row with Senor Severino, and now, in the middle of the night, Andre and all his people had vanished, doubtless back to their Maloca, for since his father's death he was the capito. The manager in Saint-Louis was quite beside himself with rage. "You will go after Andre tomorrow with my men," he said. "You will bring me back this bandit, dead or alive. If he won't come of his own free will, then shoot him and bring me his head." He even said that the boss in Guajara wanted to see the heads of all the Indians who did not obey his orders. I said I was quite ready to help bring in Andre, but I was not prepared to cut off his head. I told him that Andre was a kinsman of mine, that the same blood flowed in our veins. At this, Senor Severino grew even more furious. "You will go with my men and no argument," he shouted. And so, on the next morning, Alfredo had set off with the 4 capangas. 3 were Brazilians and 1 a Bolivian. It had rained the whole day, and in the evening they had arrived, wet through and hungry, at Andre's old Maloca, but it was burnt down, and so they slept in the forest and postponed their search until the next day. Then they found a small path, and a little round Maloca, and finally Andre too with all his people. They bound the hands of all the men, including Andre, behind their backs. They all tamely submitted. Only one man was missing. He and his wife had vanished into the forest. Alfredo went with one of the capangas to look for them. The others remained in the Maloca. One sat in the hammock and ate ground nuts, and the other went into the forest to cut himself a stick. The third also went out. Then Andre called a woman over. He said something to her in a low whisper, and not long afterwards a small boy crept up to Andre from behind with a kitchen knife and cut his bonds. All this happened behind the back of the capanga, who was sitting in the hammock chewing ground nuts. Andre seized an old axe which lay on the ground and split the capanga's skull. He slumped in the hammock without a sound. Andre snatched up the shotgun and a Winchester which were standing near the hammock. He was about to go after the other 2, but just at that moment one of them came in through the door of the hut. He saw his companion lying dead in the hammock, and then Andre fired a charge of shot in his face, and followed it with a bullet from the Winchester. The capanga, who had gone to cut himself a stick, came running up at the sound of the shots. Andre fired at him with the Winchester, but the shot did not kill him. The man thus attacked set about Andre with a bush knife, and for a moment things looked bad for Andre, but the white man was weakened by his wound, and finally Andre struck him down. Alfredo himself had not seen all this. The 2 of them in the forest had heard the shots, and thought that the fugitive couple had returned to the Maloca, and that their friends were now firing the shots as signals. They were glad that they no longer had to wander about in the sodden forest, and turned back. But when they got to the middle of the maize plantation, near the hut, 2 more shots rang out. I just saw my companion jerk convulsively and raise his gun, ran Alfredo's story. and then he shot wildly at the Maloka. He ran behind a tree trunk, which was lying on the ground there, and took fresh aim, but he did not fire again. Andre had killed him with 2 shots in the chest. In the Maloka I found Andre and the 3 dead Kapungas. "What do we do now?" I asked Andre. "Let's go to Mutum." So we left the dead men lying where they were and all went to the chief Mutum. Even in those days he had his Maloka in the direction of the Rio Colorado. There the women made a great quantity of chicha, and we discussed what was to be done. Mutum remained with his people in the Maloka, but we young men went to Salawi and talked under cover of darkness with our friends there. Then, early next morning, Andre lay in wait, well concealed outside the barracão. He knew that immediately on getting up, the manager always went outside the hut to make water. Then he put a bullet through his chest. Severino realized at once what was happening. "Don't do it, Andre," he screamed, and ran to the mango tree, where Andre was hidden. Then he collapsed. He was dead. Next, old João came to the window of the barracão to see what was happening. He too was immediately met by a bullet, and then it was the turn of the manager's wife and a woman relative of Severino, who also lived in the barracão. Andre's friend, Guapor, seized her little child and flung it into the river alive. There were 9 killed altogether. Then we went back to the Maloka again. Such was the story which Alfredo had to tell. He passed over in silence the fact that he himself had killed one of the white women with a club. After all, he was no savage. Only 2 civilizados escaped the bloodbath. I had many a chat with one of them, an old half-blind negro with crinkled white hair, who today lives on charity in Salawi. "I was damned lucky," he said, his toothless mouth puckered into a grin. "I just happened to be further upriver for a few weeks in a colocacao, gathering Brazil nuts with one of my mates. Then one day along came a caboclo from Salawi and told us that Andre had killed the manager and all the civilizados. We laughed. Rumors, we said. We know all about Indian gossip." The caboclo was offended, and if the river hadn't been running so high on the day in question, then you 2 would also be dead. Andre intended to do you in as well, but the current was too strong for him to come up. At first we didn't believe a word the caboclo said, but then at last we went to Salawi to see what was going on there. But there wasn't a manager there any longer, and not a single civilizado. Those devils had killed about a dozen people. That shook us, and we rode to the mouth of the river, as if old Nick himself were after us. After a few days, the post steamer arrived. We sent a letter to the boss in Guajara and looked for work somewhere else. In Guajara, there was some hard thinking about what was to be done in the circumstances. Was the whole profitable Bronco district to be lost to its owner and given up to murderers? Might not that be the start of a countrywide revolt of the Indians? The opponents of the state Indian protection system and of the missionaries triumphed. There, they cried, was all the thanks of the dear, kind Indians whom General Rondon and his sentimental friends wanted to protect and pamper. Lo, treacherous beasts, these savages, they said. There's only one argument to be used, bullets. It must by now have dimly dawned upon the owner of Saint-Louis that things had been going on in his distant empire of which he knew nothing. The mayor of Guajara dispatched a detachment of police, but no one ventured to go near the grim place. Too many white men had already fallen to the arrows of the Indians, and the caboclos of the Rio Branco were even familiar with the use of rifles. Then they remembered Senor Regino. He had worked for many years in Saint-Louis, but he had not got on with the new manager, and had sought his living on another river. He was approached, for he was known to be a good friend of the Indians. He alone could negotiate a peace. Regino landed quite alone in Saint-Louis. The police commission followed cautiously behind, armed to the teeth. How the negotiations proceeded, I have never found out, but peace was made, and the Indians were not punished. Their promise not to do it again was accepted as sufficient. Nor did they do it again, for now the day had passed in Saint-Louis when the whip cracked and the Kapangas were sent out. Such was the story of Andre, with whom we proposed to spend the night. I was all agog to meet him, and asked my companions what kind of a man this mass murderer was. He is a good caboclo, they answered. He always has plenty to eat when you go into his hut, and he's a good rubber gatherer too. He and his brother delivered the most rubber in the last Fabrico. We came to a small stream and balanced our way over the tree trunk which had been felled to serve as a bridge. The bank and the path which led on from there were well beaten. Andre's wives fetch water from here, the Brazilians explained. We soon reached a small clearing. In front of us rose a large hut, its roof of palm leaves reaching down to the ground. A few TUPARI stood about, waiting outside it. I was to be the first to go in. I slipped through the low entrance, but it was a good while before my eyes had grown accustomed to the semi-darkness. Then I made out a naked man sitting on a stool. "That is Andre," a young TUPARI whispered to me. I went up to the man and held out my hand. "Boa tarde," I greeted him. He took my hand, but did not utter a single word, nor did he look at me. A strange fellow, I thought. Is he furious at our visit, or is he perhaps always so bad-tempered? I looked round a bit more, and discerned in the depths of the hut 3 naked women. One was rocking in her hammock, and held a baby in her arms. The 2 others were squatting by small fires, stirring clay cooking pots. They seemed not to notice us. It was the first time that I had ever been able to have a glimpse of the family life of naked Indians, and my curiosity was correspondingly great. After a while, Andre suddenly stood up and vanished. Soon he appeared again. He had put on a pair of trousers. "Do you come from Saint-Louis?" he now asked in Portuguese, and looked me straight in the face. "From Saint-Louis," I confirmed. "Is the German there?" he went on. "He is still there," I replied, "but he is soon going to Guajara to fetch supplies. The boss hasn't arrived yet. A good thing the German is going to Guajara went on the Indian seriously. "We have no clothes or anything left. Have you brought any shirts with you?" "Shirts," I said. "No, I'm sorry, no shirts." "But needles and thread then?" asked Andre. His face revealed that a negative answer would not have surprised him. "Yes, I have some needles and thread. I'll unpack them later on. And some little mirrors." His Mongolian eyes scrutinized my face still further. "My wives have no mirrors," he persisted. "I have some little mirrors too. I will give you 2. Andre seemed well pleased. Could this be the mass murderer who had terrified the police of the whole district? He now drew up 2 small stools. We sat down and chatted of this and that. My strange host's bad mood seemed suddenly to have left him. An Indian in shirt and trousers came into the hut with a gun in his hand. Andre called him over. "Greet the Senor," he commanded imperiously. "This is my brother," he said, turning to me. One of the women stood up, fetched a dress, and slipped into it. Another Indian appeared completely naked, apart from the small leaf over his penis. He did not greet me, seemed not to notice me at all, and sat down on a stool. The naked woman with the baby crept out of the hammock and squatted on the ground in front of me. "This is a doctor," said Andre quietly. "He has come over from Ayabuti Maloka. My child is very sick." Once again he had become very solemn, and looked attentively over at the little group. The witch doctor began to execute some strange gestures. He waved both arms round in the air, brushed his hands over the child, then again over his own body, breathed and panted as he did so, and then sucked away at the body of the small patient. Then he made a sign to Andre. "Stay here and don't move." The latter commanded me gruffly, got up and sat down beside his wife, who, with an impassive countenance, looked down at the baby on her naked thighs. The magician now carried out the same magic movements over the father's body too, and Andre, with set face, bore it all patiently. Then he came back to me. He was once again in a better humor. "Have you any medicine for my child?" he asked me. "What's wrong with them?" A long explanation followed, of which I could not make head or tail. Finally I gave him some aspirin. Andre knew the tablets and the dose. "What roots are those hanging over the door?" I asked him. His face darkened. "That is the poison which a Yabuti gave me to drink in my chicha," he answered. "He wanted to kill me. I had a terrible stomachache for a long time. Then this magician got the roots out of my stomach, like this." He imitated the magician's sucking. "Now I am almost well again. Without the doctor I should have died." He got up and went to a suitcase which was lying on a stand. He came back with a wallet in his hand and unfolded a piece of paper. He passed it over to me, eyeing me keenly the while. It was a letter from the manager in Saint-Louis to the effect that Andre had delivered so and so many kilograms of rubber, and after deduction of the goods supplied to him, had a credit balance of 1,200 cruzeros. Andre could neither read nor write. I read the letter out to him. He beamed, folded the certificate up again, and put it back into the wallet. He then picked out 2 photographs, the journalist from the journalist S from Buenos Aires had taken them and developed and printed them on the spot. One of them showed Andre decked out in his feathers, the other the journalist's wife, lying as far as I could see, stark naked in a hammock. She herself had left this one behind for Andre as a keepsake, he told me. Evening had drawn on. We went outside the hut. In the little clearing the Tupari were squatting. They had been out into Andre's fields and brought back corncobs and papas. The tropero had arrived with the asses and carried my baggage into the hut. A scene of great activity ensued. Andre and his brother produced an incredible quantity of game. Full pots were set down in the middle of the clearing, and mysterious moquicas placed beside them. The Tupari and the rubber-gatherers looked on with close interest. Everyone says Andre is a wretched fellow, and gives his guest nothing to eat, said Andre. A classical example of fishing for compliments. The rubber workers, who had known him for a long time, were quick to assure him that he was an unusually capable worker and hunter, and the most hospitable man for miles around. Andre beamed. He fetched a stool and invited me to sit down. With the courteous gesture of an experienced host, he placed an earthenware plate before me and said, "Here, eat this, then I will eat what's left." The plate was filled to the edge with fat worms, baked to a golden yellow. They looked like the larvae of cockchafers. "I hope you enjoy it," I thought, "but you'll have to make a start sooner or later." Stretched out my hand to the plate and acted as if I had never been accustomed to anything else all my life. I was just about to take cautious hold of one of the larvae when I started back in alarm. The worm began to move. It wriggled and stretched and contracted again, like an accordion in the hands of some high-spirited musician. Then I was seized by a disgust which no effort of will, or even the example of the Indians and rubber-gatherers, could overcome. "I also prefer my larva well roasted," grinned one of the Brazilians, "but they can also be eaten alive if necessary. They taste like the purest butter." I shuddered. Andre was at first deeply disappointed, but soon recovered and brought me the leg of a wild boar. He then ate the larva himself. As night came on, we spread our hammocks in the spacious hut. "It's not fair that you should have two wives, and good friends and neighbors like ourselves, not even one," said one of the rubber-gatherers, trying to jest with Andre, but his voice betrayed that he was more serious than he would like to admit. The Indian's eyes suddenly gleamed, but he made no answer, merely smiling in a superior way. No one would dare to touch his wives. That massacre years before had served many a useful purpose.